We have gathered here to have a discussion on the topic, the curious connection between Cuba and Kerala. And by placing this book, Mad About Cuba, a Malayali revisits the revolution by none other than Ullekh NP. We have the author with us today. So this book is a narrative, a travel narrative account of his visit to the most fascinating island nation, Cuba of the Caribbeans. And we know that from Kerala, the name Cuba is not something new for our political discourses. Cuba has always been as the author himself mentions in this book, Cuba has always been a curious cousin of Kerala in the fields of politics, culture, etc. And this book is a particular account from the vantage point of a global South. Because as we know that the Western media, especially the American media, has portrayed Cuba from a very darker shades. And this is a compelling account from the vantage point, the perspective of a global South nations. So in that sense, we will come to this conversation. What is the connection between Cuba and Kerala, or what is to be, how the Malayalis are mad about Cuba. So to begin with, as we know, the theme of this year's Mathrubhumi International Festival of Letters is regarding change. And we are facing a political change in the North America where Donald Trump has came to power as the President of America again. And we know that the history of economic embargo faced by Cuba, the trade embargo faced by Cuba for the last 60 years, and there is a point of intensification of that particular trade embargo by the re-entry of Donald Trump. So to begin with, sir, how do you see that? How do you see the significance of this book in this particular moment, this crucial juncture in the geopolitical arena?
Hello, everyone. Yeah, we are living in interesting times, and I see Cuba as a metaphor for a country that is financially strangled, politically isolated by the most powerful, the biggest military in the world. So in that sense, it's interesting to see what's happening, especially what's going to happen, especially because Trump is in power. And Trump wasn't in power when I wrote the book. But we had expectations, or people had anticipated that Trump would come to power. But nobody had anticipated that he would have as his Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, whose political trajectory is built on anti-Cuban politics and lies. Lies because he had said that his family, his father, was forced out of Cuba following Fidel Castro's coming to power and the revolution of 1959. In fact, it's the American media, and I mentioned in this book that had busted all the claims, and previously on his Wikipedia entry, it was said that his father was a victim of Fidel's politics. But later on it was found that he had to leave, and his family had to leave Cuba in 1956, 3 years before the Cuban Revolution. So I know Cuba better than Marco Rubio, and Marco Rubio's family had to leave Cuba because of the connections with the narcotics business, which is why some reporters tend to call him Narco Rubio, saying, his family was interested in narcotics business. So it's especially there is this problem because Trump is not interested in Marco Rubio handling either China or Ukraine or Russia. He has given his pointsmen, he has already named other people to handle those subjects, and so that leaves Marco Rubio, a well-known anti-Cuban politician who has risen on the back of his victimhood card, the license to do everything, and which explains the reason why within a week of Biden taking Cuba out of the list of countries sponsoring terrorism, and within a day of Trump assuming power, Cuba was brought back on the list of terror sponsoring countries. So Marco Rubio is acting fast, he's acting swiftly, and for him it's a personal thing. And this also means that Cuba is going to suffer more because there are a lot of things that I have written in this book about the blockade that Cuba faces. And it started, interestingly, I'll go slow on that because It started, in fact, in 1960 when it became apparent to the US administration that Cuba is not going to be a country very friendly with Americans. I don't know the reasons behind it, or maybe they chose let's have an enemy in the neighborhood like Cuba. You don't know what was the provocation. But in 1960, there was a guy called Lester Mallory, and he was a U.S. U.S. State Department official. He wrote an internal memo. And I'm talking about this guy. You might wonder, why am I talking about Lester Mallory, an ordinary official who prepared an internal memo for the consumption of, including the then President of the United States, because I think his memo holds true even now, and that Americans are still haunted by Lester Mallory's memo. That memo says that this is the content, and it's important to know the content, that the people of, the leaders of Cuba are very popular, and it's not easy to dethrone them. So what you have to do is you have to put in measures that reduce the real incomes, the wages of people, and then you have to force them into hunger and then starvation. And when they are, when you force them into hunger and starvation, there is going to be a lot of frustration, and out of frustration, they'll be forced to revolt against the government. This is what the Americans are doing at the moment, and it was evident from their policies, especially in the 90s, when the Americans got a golden opportunity to normalize relations with Cuba, because it was the time the Americans and the rest of the world, you talked about global south, that was the time after the fall of the Soviet Union, was the time when the global north tried and successfully normalized relations with the rest of the world they were hostile with. And you look at even South Africa, you look at the relations between US and Vietnam, they normalized it all, but they had that golden opportunity to normalize relations with Cuba. And instead, what we had were more sanctions, and especially by the Democrats. Democrats were in power in that. First was George Bush, and then Clinton came to power, and both of them slapped a series of draconian sanctions on Cuba. Which shows that when there was an opportunity, which I think was a golden opportunity, they didn't do that. And it's a breakaway. It's contrary to what they had done in other parts of the world, which is what makes Cuba very special in the world, apart from the fact that it's the only country which has survived American sanctions for this long without actually having them do a regime change. Which is why our discussion on Cuba makes a lot of, it's important to discuss Cuba at this point.
So to begin from the point that he was mentioning about Marco Rubio, the falsified narrative made by Marco Rubio to denigrate the image of Cuba is something that is not new for us in this age of post-truth, where false news and fabricated news have been tarnishing the image of the state also. We are trying to trace the connection between Cuba and Kerala at that point in time with the leftist political leanings, and as a cultural signifiers of Che Guevara, Fidel Castro and their grandma is very popular across Kerala. Grandma is a yacht in which Che and Fidel came back to Cuba from Mexico for the revolution. So in that sense, the cultural signifiers of Cuba, the Cuban revolution, etc. are very popular in Kerala. So there is a sense of solidarity that we forge with the island nation of Cuba in the name of the political lineage of this state, in the name of cultural contributions of Cuban figures for the state, and also in the sense that the social welfare schemes initiated by Kerala and Cuba, which forms a model for the whole world and for the whole Indian nation. In that point in time, also where the Goebbelses of this post-truth era trying to tarnish the image of both Cuba and Kerala together. So in that sense, sir, how do you see the connection between Cuba and Kerala, and how is it portrayed in this book?
No, Kerala is people of Kerala are fair-minded. They have had their share of fascinations with countries and people across the world. And I think we had at one point of time there was fascination even with Hitler. There was fascination with Mussolini, and after the October Revolution, we had fascination with Soviet Union. We had fascination with China in the 40s, in the late 40s, and also in the 50s, especially in the 60s. So I think there was a gap after the fall of the Soviet bloc of countries. Yeah, China stood still. China was unhurt, but there was a romantic link for obvious reasons with. Countries that were part of the Soviet bloc and the socialist bloc, then they disappeared. And it was then that Cuba became more important to the collective conscience of Kerala before that, because I'm talking about this point because when Che Guevara came visiting India in 1959, and that was the time India and Cuba started their diplomatic, India and the revolutionary Cuba started diplomatic ties. So the Communist Party, mainstream Communist Party leaders of that time were not interested in meeting Che Guevara. Although he had gone to Calcutta, he had never come to Kerala. He had traveled to Delhi. He had traveled to Calcutta. He had visited the Indian Statistical Institute in Calcutta. But none of the communist leaders, the mainstream communist leaders, were interested in meeting Che Guevara at that point of time. I think it was also because that was a time when Nehru was busy sacking the EMS government in here in Kerala, and also because it was around that time the mainstream communist parties had identified the Cuban movement to be a little pro-China, or at least in their for all practical reasons, in the way they had, if you talk about armed struggle, armed revolution, and there was at the same time, at the same point of time, there was a underlying growth. There was at least an indication of growth of the Naxalite kind of movement, which later on became, the Naxalite movement was not born then, but there were extreme factions within the who had left the breakaway factions of the Communist Party, had made the Communist Party, had given Communist Party a lot of headache. So it was after the death, or rather the demise of Maoist movement or the Naxalite influence that, and also after the fall of the Soviet Union, that people of Kerala, in a large sense, aided by the Communist Party, started thinking and also propagating, and they started bringing in Cuba into mainstream Communist Party's discourse. So I think it was they were filling a gap, and more than that is that is one aspect of it. And there is another thing, because like Kerala, Cuba is also, if you look at the economic models, Kerala is an example or a metaphor for redistribution-oriented economic policies, which helped us achieve social growth, and we have social parameters on a par with Nordic countries, which is true in much more it in a bigger way in the case of Cuba. The social growth of Cuba, if you compare, in Travancore and other parts of Kerala, we had a certain amount of social growth even before Kerala was formed as a state in 1956, and the communist parties came to power and initiated certain policies with far-reaching consequences. And so in Cuba it was the opposite. The female literacy was almost nil, and it was in single digits. And within years of the revolution, you had Cuba was able to make huge strides, and it's notable that when I visited almost all the scientific institutions in Cuba, including its burnished showpiece of research and development excellence, which is Cuba Pharma, which is a constellation of some 40 odd R&D units. Most of those people at the helm were women. They are women, and most of those people who have done breakthrough research in pharmaceuticals and chemistry and also all kinds of scientific fields, including engineering, are women. So this happened within the first decades of, by 1970s we could see it. 1960s and by 70s they had overtaken most of the most advanced countries in the world in social growth. So this was a model that was destined to create a lot of problems in the minds of people, because you have free education, free healthcare, you had a lot of things happening 90 kilometers away from the coast of Florida, 90 kilometers away from, from there, 90 kilometers away, the Americans were struggling, especially the poor Americans were struggling, and they had to pay huge fees to get their children educated. They had to pay huge fees, and they would die if they are not rich enough to afford healthcare. So this was a model that suddenly made American policymakers uncomfortable. So that explains why they wanted that model to die. And of course, thanks to Soviet Union, thanks to the alignment that happened after the Bay of Pigs attack in 1961, until the demise of Soviet Union, they had a relatively good time. They had foreign exchange coming in. They had economic cooperation with countries in the Eastern Bloc, Eastern European Bloc, and also several other countries that had the guts at that time to defy the Americans before they all lost the guts, because the world had become unipolar all of a sudden with the demise of the Soviet Union. So I think, Kerala is a state, so it has its limitations, but the political trajectory and also the economic model that we had inherited, and also the kind of discussions, and also the whole literature that had always influenced Kerala, all these factors contributed to making Cuba a big attraction in Kerala. And of course there are similarities, but there are most dissimilarities because of the fact that Cuba chose a model and it had to be self-sufficient. And thanks to the blockade, a lot of things are changing.
So since we are speaking about the connection between Kerala and Cuba, sir, with your permission, can I read 2 or 3 lines from the first chapter of the book? The Dominican tourist and I had bought almost the same set of books on the Cuban Revolution from the hotel bookshop. He had purchased the Spanish editions and I the English ones. Standing in the queue to pay up, we had exchanged warm smiles. In my home state of Kerala, which falls in the southern part of India and where we speak Malayalam, we describe such an instant affinity for each other with the phrase, Rektam Rektate Tiricharanju. That's the way in which he, in the first chapter itself, he hooks up to the Cuban connection of Kerala. Since we spoke about the scientific advancement in Cuba, something that came to my mind in the age of Elon Musk and Tesla, we usually link science and technological advancement with capitalism. Because whenever we speak about a scientifically advanced nation, that naturally becomes a capitalist nation. And we have a model from Cuba where they supply medicines, vaccines, etc. to the African countries who are downtrodden, who are facing civil wars and other strife. So in that sense, sir, usually there is a criticism that socialism is practically impossible in any nation in the world. But Cuba is presenting a model where they use socialism for not only their national concerns, but also as a part of their internationalist ideology. So how do you see that?
I don't think it's just outcome of socialist policy. I think even in the US, if you look at it, who commercialized Pfizer? It was, who commercialized Viagra? It was Pfizer. Who commercialized internet? It was those big private technology companies. Who privatized algorithm-oriented apps? These are private companies. But who invented the internet? Who invented Viagra? Who invented a lot of things that we currently associate with big technology companies? These were all invented thanks to public money. It was a taxpayer that paid for most of these inventions that happened either in the military or in laboratories or in private-public partnerships in NASA. So these were done for a public good, and there are economists who have spoken at length about all these things, who have discussed these issues, challenging the common notion that R&D and all these kind of developments happen thanks to privatization and private investment. No, it has happened thanks to taxpayers' money, public financing of projects. But yeah, again, coming to Cuba, it's also true coming to Cuba that research and development happened on a shoestring budget, and they've made great advances in several fields. Because if you look at even vaccines, when Cuba, look at the COVID period, Cuba was stopped, prevented from acquiring COVID vaccines from the US because of the blockade. Because of certain provisions of the blockade meant that they needn't be given vaccines, but they created their own one. And I haven't heard of any kind of post-vaccine deaths because people took Abdala vaccine, which was widely used across Latin America after Cuba produced it. So similar is the case with certain medicines to cure liver cancer and so many kinds of skin diseases. And the R&D, pharmaceutical R&D development in Cuba actually focuses more on the diseases that the Cubans have. Most of them are chain smokers, and had it not been for their healthcare system, which emphasizes on prevention, because there is a GP who has to take care of some 100 to 150 homes, and who goes every day to check how people are doing, especially the elderly are doing. And so people, the doctors I've met there, they complain that the people are generally lazy. They drink a lot, they smoke a lot, but the life expectancy levels and also the health levels of people are higher because of this active intervention by the health department of Cuba. So it's happening. So, we have all heard of the great strides that Cuba has made in terms of traveling to the most depressed situations and also the most chaotic situations to help in healthcare, in providing healthcare. That's also because the Cuban doctors who travel, they earn money. So Cubans need money. Cubans need money. That's why these doctors go. But if you look at the R&D development, it's an investment that dates to the time of Che Guevara, Che Guevara said, it's not enough that we depend on other countries, including the Soviet Union, for our needs. We have to have our own unit, and we shouldn't focus. Che Guevara said that we shouldn't focus, or we shouldn't just depend on any single crop or any single product, or tobacco or sugar. We should have a large basket of things to export, and a large and also a robust healthcare sector in which we produce our own medicines and export them. And this was the vision that Che Guevara had, and we hardly talk about these things because the world is fixated with, the world is obsessed with Che Guevara, the revolutionary. and not as much with Che Guevara, the visionary administrator. So that was a question. No, yeah. So you can ask me the next question.
Yeah, actually, I was thinking that he was answering my next question. So, what would be the thing that I would ask? Now, we'll move on to two prominent, iconic figures of Cuban Revolution. That is Ernesto Guevara and Fidel Castro. In that sense, Ernesto Guevara, whom we Malus appropriated ourselves as our own Che Guevara. Che Guevara was somebody who had a different vision about the economy, the social setting, and I think he was the minister in charge of industries or something in Cuba. So in that sense, he had a different vision about the economic development of Cuba, which is largely underrepresented in literature, because we know him for the revolutionary rigor that he had. We usually symbolize him as the icon of revolution. In that sense, this book particularly offers a fresh perspective about the economic and political ideologies of Che Guevara. And also Fidel Castro. Fidel Castro was a person who represented both Cuban nationalism and Marxism. He had a strain of Cuban nationalism which was a continuation to what propagated by Jose Marti in Cuba. So I just wanted to hear from you about your perspective on a different Che Guevara and a different Fidel Castro.
Fidel Castro was not a communist to begin with. He was far more accommodative as regards his policies and politics. The way many of the storied revolutionaries of the Cuban Revolution of 1959 were, except with the probable exception of Che Guevara and Raul Castro, none of the others were Marxists. And Camilo Cienfuegos, he passed away very young, and he wasn't. And the rest of the leaders, they were more nationalist in their outlook. And it was not even, Fidel Castro never wanted to make a communist state out of Cuba, in Cuba. So, but it so happened that the Americans became hostile to them because Cuba until that time was a haven for all American mafia. All the mobsters used to congregate, and it was a place where the Americans could do and sin. And there was no sin in Cuba. It was a place where law and order of other places did not apply. You could come and do anything. It was a holiday destination of the high and mighty in the US. So suddenly that thing got over. The mobsters had to leave. The hotels, the mobsters, a lot of companies that had sponsored or were Binami properties of the American mob had to return. That must have caused a lot of heartburn in the US administration, many of whom were frequent visitors to Cuba over the weekend in boats that used to carry the rich and famous, the rich and infamous, in fact. So that must have been the reason at that time. So I'm sure you all remember that Fidel Castro had traveled to the US to meet with American leaders after the revolution of 1959, and he was relatively treated well. And in the run-up to the revolution of 1959, it was the American journalists that, in fact, created a hero out of Fidel Castro. And unlike his persona that we saw later, in which he spoke exclusively in Spanish. If you look at the early videos of Fidel Castro that were aired by Associated Press and a lot of other media groups, including CBS and NPR in the US, these were all sympathetic portrayals of a leader who wanted, a young man who wanted to create change in the Caribbean country, in the island nation. So it was a hugely sympathetic portrayal of Fidel Castro, and there was no inkling at all of a communist rule descending over Cuba. And why wasn't there any inkling? Because Fidel Castro himself was not a communist at that time. And of course, the whole world had, at that time there was an ideological divide, and one had to choose between these two camps. So, in the case of Cuba, I think, Cuba was forced into choosing a military ally in Soviet Union, especially because the Americans did not like the way the American mobsters, the mafia, was treated by Fidel Castro's Cuba after 1959. And this was the reason why, without any provocation, the man I had mentioned earlier, Lester Mallory, wrote an internal memo about a regime change long before anything provocative, anything explosive had happened between the US and Cuba. The American administration, the US administration, the State Department had decided that we'll make an enemy out of Cuba. What else could be the reason other than the fact that they lost a holiday home where they could sin? They could have weekend getaways where they could do anything. There wasn't any other reason. So, when you look at Fidel Castro's political shift towards communism, it happened after the 1961 Bay of Pigs attack, where he and his country faced existential dilemma. It was much more than an existential dilemma. They were on the verge of being thrown out, and then after that, they had to align with Soviet Union and invite them to set up a base. And the Soviets, especially Khrushchev at that time, he immediately obliged, because he saw it as a counterweight to having a base in Cuba near the United States, because the United States had a base where they had nuclear warheads and other arms in Turkey. So Khrushchev used it as an opportunity to get Americans out of Turkey, and that was the deal that finally they stuck to avert the nuclear war in 1962 after the Cuban Missile Crisis. Again, coming back to Fidel Castro. Fidel Castro, anyone who had read, because I read the translation of Fidel Castro's conversations on Christianity with Frei Beto. He was a Brazilian friar. Before I read the version in English, it was titled Fidel Castro Madate Patti. It's very clear he had a certain affinity for Roman Catholic faith. He had a certain kind of affinity for nationalism, the Cuban nationalism championed by the likes of Jose Marti. And Jose Marti was hoisted as national hero for no other reason, because they believed in, and even if you look at Che Guevara's policies, that although he was Argentine, he's from another country. He imbibed the spirit of Cuba, and he decided that we'll have a set of policies to govern ourselves, not under the diktats of Soviet Union, but on our own. So, which was the reason why it's important to understand Cuba from its strengths, its history, its traditions, and they have a religion called Santeria, which is a blend of Christianity and African faiths, which is the faith of people who had come from the Congo, the Yoruba tribe. So at the moment, there are more people under the Santeria religion in Cuba than, although religion is not that important, although religion is not made to feel it as an overwhelming presence in the country, Santeria religion has the largest following of all religions in Cuba. So it's true, and the communist people, especially in the 90s, the Communist Party of Cuba decided to get rid of a certain phrase which had disallowed believers from being members of the Communist Party. It was done long before communist parties of other countries had done. So it was some kind of a destiny. It was an existential dilemma. It was a military priority that drove Fidel Castro to the Soviet camp. And otherwise, he was a nationalist, and if you look at the comparisons, even Ho Chi Minh was far more nationalist than he was a communist, but it was certain other compulsions of, again, when you are under existential crisis as a country, you have to do certain things that are diplomatic, that are political, and then you are guided by certain other reasons than your ideology or a certain kind of a belief in a certain kind of a system that you're going to promote in a certain country. That's what happened in the case of Fidel Castro. And also, if you look at those early videos in which Fidel Castro sworn in as president, in the his earliest speech, his first speech after the Cuban Revolution, there were two doves that came and sat on the shoulders of Fidel Castro. And the people of Cuba, and people of Cuba reflected the priorities of people of, or at least the other way around, the priorities of the leaders reflected the priorities and beliefs of the people of Cuba. So it was seen as a divine intervention, and the newspapers wrote about it. So it shows how much Cuban that was, how much of the sense of being Cuban was in Fidel Castro. And I think in the case of Che Guevara, does that answer my question about Fidel Castro? But in the case of Che Guevara, I think he learned it because he's someone, I'd gone through a lot of papers which are now translated from the Spanish into English, and a lot of declassified CAA notifications, and also some rare literature from certain authors that show that he, of course, he was a revolutionary, and was he a successful revolutionary? We don't know. I mean, he didn't succeed in either he succeeded in Angola in the war against apartheid South Africa, but he didn't succeed in the Congo. He didn't succeed in Bolivia. But that doesn't make him any less a revolutionary. But was he a practical revolutionary? We don't know. I have my doubts. But was he a practical administrator? He was. You can, anyone who reads these documents will surely be convinced that he was spot on about the problems that Cuba had faced at that time, and the prescriptions he had for Cuba's growth, which were in sharp contrast with that of the Soviet Union, not based on long-term planning or just a focus on any single crop or a product for export. So Che Guevara was also, he was a nationalist in that sense, but he was more ideologically Marxist. And perhaps he was the only one, who was a Marxist in that, among the top leaders of the Cuban Revolution, with the probable exception of Raul Castro. And he went on to reread Karl Marx to counter the arguments that the Soviet policymakers had prescribed for Cuba. And the CAA document shows certain kind of a frustration about Che Guevara showing disrespect for the Soviet Union. I mean, isn't it so surprising that Soviets were the sworn enemy of the Americans, and they didn't like this guy who showed some kind of disrespect towards the Soviet Union and the kind of policy they had suggested for Cuba. Maybe they found him to be a troublemaker that even the Soviet Union can't handle. So that could be the thing. I think he was, in a sense, a nationalist because he had learned from his Cuban experience, and he understood what Cuba needed, which explains why even now some of his, Che Guevara's presence is there for all to see in Cuba Pharma. In all the R&D projects that have succeeded. And I don't think at that time Fidel Castro was very kicked about the idea of defying the Soviet Union. But in hindsight, Che Guevara had the last laugh.
Since we had a discussion about religion and secularism in Cuba, once again I would like to read one or two observations from the book. For someone who had read Fidel Castro's conversation with Fray Beto on religion, I wasn't surprised that the motives of the past, as well as traditional and Christian rituals, were allowed to coexist with communist ideology. Again, communist parties in general now want to project themselves as forces of resistance against divisive political outfits and global hegemons, and not as ideologically rigid entities inimical to religious and ancient beliefs. I think a similar strand of argument can be seen in most of the accounts related to Cuba about the secular outlook of the society. One more example is the recent Malayalam book Vazhve Manithar by Nitish Narayanan, where he speaks about the same things about the women empowerment, secularism, etc. in Cuba. Now, coming back to the book. We, as a student of literature, we have a tendency to classify books into different genres, watertight compartments called genres. But when I first took this book for reading, I thought that I'm going to read a travelogue. But to my surprise, as chapters moved on, I was reading a history, I was reading a political commentary, I was reading a well-articulated research article with citations. I don't see usually in travel narratives there are not many people who use quotations from research scholars and all. So this is a book where all these elements have seamlessly woven into one blend. So in that sense, sir, I want you to speak about two things. First thing is about your visit to Cuba. Was it official or personal? And how long have you been planning a visit to Cuba? And second thing, how did you conceive this book? The beginning of this book and the process of writing.
It was a personal visit, and it was a personal visit in the sense that I had longed for this visit, and there is always an opportunity that comes knocking, and then I made it a personal visit when there was an opportunity. So it was not my intention to write a book, although I don't see that that was completely off the charts. Maybe it was at the back of my mind that I should write a book, but the primary drive was to write about Cuba or see for myself what's happening in Cuba, because it was important, because Cuba is we all read every day in the newspapers about the hardship that the Cubans face because of these blockade, the American-led blockade, which is an international blockade because of obvious reasons. And for the last, I want to stress on this fact, since 1994, the United Nations General Assembly had voted asking at past resolutions year after year, probably with the exception of this COVID year 2020, asking Americans to lift the unilateral sanctions. And a vast majority of people, a brute majority of people, close to 190 countries had asked Americans to lift those sanctions. So that is the international opinion. So naturally the American reasons are silly, and I wanted to see for myself how people are coping with the situation, especially because these sanctions meant that there were shortages, including of food, medicines, and raw materials. And as I saw it there, that the infrastructure that they have is what they had in the 1970s and the 80s. And when what is called the special period, that they call it the special period after the economic crisis, after the fall of the Soviet Union, starting from early 1990s until Hugo Chavez came to power in Venezuela and started extending help, and also with Putin retaining power or coming to power in Russia. Until then, they had a very difficult time politically and economically, because they lost out on a lot of trade partners all over the world, and the Americans at the same time chose to strangulate them financially much more than they had done in the previous decades. So this is the Cuba I wanted to know, because I wanted to know what is the real picture there. And I found a vibrant nation with very friendly people, with a worn out infrastructure, because they didn't have the opportunity, economic opportunity or the political opportunity to build infrastructure, healthcare or otherwise, or transport infrastructure afterwards. And This meant, reporting for the world what is happening thanks to the sanctions. And how come that Americans haven't been able to effect a regime change in that country despite meeting these yardsticks that Lester Mallory had prescribed, which is, there isn't extreme poverty, but for someone who lives in a country like India, in a middle class setup, we would consider their situation as a half starvation, or they are in hunger. They have very few choices, and most people they don't have fruits to eat. They skip egg, or they skip chicken, or they skip at least once or twice a day, although meat is the staple food. So this meant that they are going through a lot of crisis, and I wanted to see it for myself, how they might be able to cope. And then I found a lot of people optimistic about leaders, and people optimistic about the future. But then there are also people who are leaving. The outmigration is huge, especially it has risen after Trump has come to power. And I have this, and that was the reason. And then I studied about a lot of things. I read, I did a lot of research, reading a lot of books about the current situation in Cuba, its history, its people. And then finally I decided to write the book, and I don't regret writing that book.
So, as we know, Grandma is not just the yard that they used to cross the Gulf of Mexico. It's also the party speak in the Cuban Communist Party. And you are a journalist yourself, so am I. So, there is this whole Western media branding of Cuban media as the state-sponsored media. So, I would like to ask you how the media functions in that country, and how what purpose is the media serving in the country, as in holding the revolution intact and passing information, both. So that is my question.
Yeah, I don't think Cuban media is independent media or anything like that, because Fidel Castro had said famously in one of his interviews that democracy and freedom of expression are different in Cuba, But I think, they don't stop people from traveling to Cuba, recording what their poverty, selling their poverty to, I'm using the word selling their poverty to the world. But now there are YouTubers who land in Cuba. They all travel through the back alleys of old Cuba, and where things are not clean, where there is there are a lot of queues before ration shops, where a lot of people sit, idle because they are unemployed, or they are not working. So these are, the image of Cuba that the rest of the world tries to tell the rest of the world. Whoever lands there to tell the rest of the world, nobody stops them. And in fact, even as early as the 1960s and 70s, this was the case. And there is a movie called Cuba and the Cameraman. And whenever he had visited Cuba, in 1960s and 70s, he used to highlight the growth of Cuba, the great strides that Cuba was making in, even economy-wise, they were making a lot of growth. So, and come to the 1990s, he started looking at Cuban poverty, and also theft, and also a lot of people complaining of poor governance, especially at the lower rungs. And Fidel Castro always made it a point to meet this director whenever he went, he traveled to Cuba, which is some kind of an endorsement of him not standing against other people coming and reporting about what is the real situation in Cuba. I don't think that happens. But to say that media in Cuba is very independent, or it offers critique of the situation there, I don't know. Maybe I found just Belly of the Beast Cuba. There is a website that does a little bit of busting of fake news about a lot of things, and along with it they talk about the real issues facing Cuba. And I don't think no media, especially of this kind, online media, tries to stop, or they always have a certain sense of responsibility when it comes to highlighting the hardship of the people. So I think that's the thing. But there is supposed to be a little bit of the Communist Party of Cuba is strict with dissemination of information by Cuban media outlets. There is also this talk that there is always not a single journalist has ever been killed, unlike if you compare with other Latin American countries in the world. But there is some kind of pressure from the government against using certain platforms or the presence in Cuba to do a hatchet job, especially those things that are sponsored by the Americans, and which is true, because there are, the U.S. federal funds for creating problems within Cuba are enormous. And the reason why this doesn't stop, this kind of propaganda against Cuba doesn't stop, is probably because you can compare it with the 4-hour wars waged by Americans and NATO allies. These wars don't stop. Similar to that, because there is a lot of money involved. Similarly, anti-Cuban propaganda that you see, especially in the legacy media, there's a lot of money involved.
I have a question. It's on Marco Rubio. What will be his efforts on Cuba next time? Because Marco Rubio, he is in power. He is in the helm of powers as a state secretary. You have mentioned that, but can you detail a bit more on that?
Yeah, Marco Rubio. This a lot of people. If you have read the book of Miami by Yuan Didion, it's there is a narrative of that the Cuban Americans, Cubans who had escaped, or who go to the US, tell about themselves that they are all victims of Fidel Castro's politics or the Communist Party. So that helps them. That makes everything smooth. So that's part of the politics of the United States, especially the politics in Florida, perhaps even in New Jersey to some extent. And this man, used it to his advantage much more than most people. Even Ted Cruz, he used that. A lot of people use that kind of, they play the victimhood card, although it's not true. So in the case of Marco Rubio, he was caught red-handed. He was caught lying. Because it's in American records that its family was had to leave, and when Batista, the previous ruler, the ruler before Fidel Castro, was in power, and it was over reasons to do with drug trafficking. So I think that's lies and all these things, do they matter anymore? Because you live in a certain kind of in America where these things don't matter. You are either with them or you are against us. If you are with Trump, you can get away with any of these things. And also, it's the power of the executive has become bigger, and the people's representatives who are there in the Congress, they are getting relegated to the sidelines. So I don't think he'll be any less effective than his predecessors in trying to stop or create troubles for Cuba. And I think for him it's a personal issue, and he'll be at it for long.
The title, Mad About Cuba, lends itself multiple interpretations. Like, it can be a deep admiration or fascination to Cuba, but it can also be a critical engagement with the politics of Cuba. So we had a a great deal of discussion with the contents of the book, as you have understood. This is not an uncritical eulogy of Cuba. This is not an uncritical eulogy of Cuba or Communist Party, but this has its own critical strand against the current politics, policies, and economy of Cuba, including the large outflow of youngsters from Cuba. But to wind up the book, I will again resort to the author himself. To wind up the session, it occurs, I quote, "It occurs to me that this defiant island nation has many lessons to offer. It is a country that shoulders endless burdens. Cubans are still trying to find the meaning of the absurdity of the decades of US blockade, and so is the rest of the world. As I head home, I cannot shake off the feeling that another revolution, this time a silent one, is in the offing." Thank you. Thank you, sir. Thank you for each and everyone for listening.